Morning. We're going to talk about bias today. Very exciting for us. Let me start the screen share. Y'all can see the slides? Okay. Sounds like we might have a little echo, so we might have to have everybody mute their microphones. And then you'll have to unmute them if you talk, because I'm going to make you talk in just a second. But
Recording is on.
first of all, I wanted to talk about what you're biased about. We talked last time about how much I am upset by physics majors. Just their existence upsets me. Some people hate certain fonts. They have passionate feelings about that. Other people really like certain things for no good reason at all. What are you biased about? What do you know you're biased about?
I'm often biased by my emotions.
Uh-huh.
They can swing around, and I let them bias me even.
I think we all do that. Yeah.
I'm biased by wanting to think that I'm not biased.
Oh, yeah. I feel that. I definitely do that too.
Or are we looking at biases that we know we have a rationality towards because of our own experiences and knowledge, or are we looking at unconscious biases that we don't necessarily have a good reason for?
Really good question.
Because a lot of our biases I know come from past experiences and just things that we know and have learned or are not even things we aren't as familiar with.
This is very true. Anybody have something they irrationally hate? The way that I'm irrationally upset by physics majors?
There are just some people that I just can't stand for no good reason, apparently. It's just I don't like
You just
you,
don't
and
like
I
them.
can't explain why.
I think we all have somebody like that.
I think it might be capitalists and business majors for me.
That's most people.
Oh,
Most people don't
yours.
like them, yeah. I found my dislike of physics major seems to not be universal and is tied to experience. Do you guys think that bias is bad?
Not necessarily.
Not
I would,
necessarily.
yeah, like if you have a bias against, I don't know, like a certain type of food or something, it might be because you actually have an allergy towards it or, something like that. I don't know if you can ground bias in something.
I don't know if it's possible to answer this question with a blanket statement when each situational bias has to be taken into account. And you have to, again, examine the basis of the bias, whether it's because an irrational, I don't like you, or whether it's like a stated trend of, well, XYZ has happened in the past, therefore we are biased against doing it this way.
I also think
bias
it's
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying, I think it's more just an unavoidable reality of life that you have to acknowledge so that way you can work with it rather than, blanketly saying it's one thing or the other.
I think bias is great, actually. It's fantastic. It is necessary. Bias allows us to function. Bias lets you do all sorts of things. If we don't have biases, we don't have the ability to make decisions, because bias is how we value information. We have inputs that come in and we make decisions about them. It can cause some problems. We have to become aware of what happens with our bias. We have two rhetorical situations that cause problems if you have bias. And one is that if our audience has a different bias than we do, and another is when it causes blind spots that interfere with our logic and our ability to clearly communicate. And there are two kinds of bias. One of you was saying this. There's bias that we're aware of and bias that we're not aware of. We call this explicit bias and implicit bias. Most bias is implicit. Most bias we're not aware of. We don't even know that we have a preference. We just maybe have some feelings sometimes, and we don't think about them very deeply. And an implicit bias is formed when your brain creates shortcuts. So we're constantly bombarded with data. Your brain can't process it. And so it learns to protect you, and it learns to help you value the information differently. And so you start to form these biases that you aren't aware of. And this can be an incredibly useful thing. In fact, I'm on the autism spectrum, and one of the things that can be challenging on it is for certain sensory input. Our brains are not as good at learning what's valuable and what's not valuable information. So we can experience extreme sensory overload. And it's because you have all the data coming in and not the ability to create a shortcut. But the shortcut is very useful. So we get the bias that way. So the experience of bias, though, is tricky, and it's hard to pinpoint our history with it. So does anybody remember when they got taught which bathrooms to use at school?
I distinctly remember in kindergarten, where this was kind of brought to our attention because sometimes when it was like just my kindergarten class going to the bathroom, the teacher would be like, okay, and we're all going to go into the wrong one. So, all the girls would go into the men's bathroom and, vice versa. And that was like a weird, trippy, like Twilight Zone thing for a 6-year-old.
It's a weird Twilight trippy zone thing for everybody, honestly. In fact, when we talk about this in real life class, when we're in a classroom, I have my students, I take them over to the bathroom, and I have somebody go in the quote unquote wrong bathroom, and they do it, and we all watch them do it, and they come out, and typically, like, they have color in their face. They've experienced dilation of capillaries. They have an increased heart rate. They're breathing a little faster. They're like a little freaked out. They have a physiological response to the fact that they've gone into something, they've broken a social norm. And these social norms, a lot of the times, sometimes we remember where they come from, but a lot of times we don't. A lot of times, most of my students never remember who taught them which bathroom to use. One student did tell a really harrowing story once about a little girl who was gender nonconforming, and she was in the line to the girls' bathroom, and a substitute teacher came and bodily in front of everybody pulled her up and removed her from the line and said, you're in the wrong line, and made this big, like, dramatic, traumatic ordeal. And I think about that situation quite a lot, but most of the time, we're not really aware why we do the things, why we have a physiological response to doing something that we're not expected to do. We just have it. We just think about it. The things we don't think about, the things we don't think to question, the things that we don't know that we're not questioning, we generally can call these doxa. This is one of those more Greek dudes saying stuff that apparently is important because they're Greek dudes, but we don't think about certain things. And if something is orthodox, this is the way that, like, most people think is the right way. It's the common way of thinking, the accepted, the correct, the righteous opinion. And you don't know that you are in an orthodox thinking group until you're exposed to heterodox, the different thought, the thought that is different from the one that you're seeing. It's really hard to study implicit bias because we're talking about studying things that we can't think to question. By definition, these are the things that we don't know about, the biases that we have that we don't know about. This was one of the most important studies that was first done on implicit bias. This was an fMRI investigation of race-related amygdala activity. For this study, what they did is they put people in functional MRI machines and they watched their brains. And they thought that they would see something. They weren't sure what they were going to see. So they showed people pictures of people, and then they watched to see what happened if they had different responses to them. And they showed pictures of different races, people of all different races, and they watched to see what happened to the brain. And they expected there to be some sort of reaction to this, but they were surprised by a couple of things. The thing that surprised them the most when they did this study was this part of the brain. I don't know if you can see the cursor when I wave it right here. This is the amygdala. The amygdala is the part of the brain that's responsible for the processing of fear. So people are having an amygdala response when they see pictures of Black men. And they kind of expected there to be some sort of response. That it was a fear-based response is not terribly surprising. But what surprised them the most was that everybody had this reaction. There wasn't a distinguishing factor. A black man looking at a picture of another black man had an amygdala fear response because of that. When they watched it, that's what you would expect if the source of the implicit bias came from the culture that you were in. If you're in a culture where you're shown images of black men and they're scary images, it teaches your brain to be afraid. This is another study that was done about visual processing of information of police officers. Police officers see a black man and they see him holding an object, and just because he's black, they think that it's a gun. They think that it's a weapon. They see something that's fearful, whether or not there is something to be afraid of. These are both implicit biases. And you wouldn't be aware when these things are happening that you're experiencing a bias. You'd be experiencing a fear is what you would experience. You don't know. You are afraid. You're afraid for your life. You're afraid for something. You would just experience the fear. So this leads us to make certain choices when we characterize things or when we talk about people. We see a black man who's been a victim of a crime, where our brain is going to tell us to be afraid and to look for a reason to be afraid. So somebody is a victim of a crime, we look for a reason to blame them. This is not something that we do for different audiences. Passive voice is another way that you can see this happening. So here's these 3 tweets. A photographer was shot in the eye. That's in the passive voice that way, and it de-narrativizes a sentence. It makes it not a story. We talked last lecture about the way that the passive voice is used to decrease emotional response intentionally. It can also be used unintentionally when we don't want to put blame on somebody, or we want to make it sound not quite as bad. And so a photographer was shot in the eye. Who shot them? We don't know. We're not putting blame on whoever shot them. We're not saying this person shot them. We're not saying it was the police that shot them. We have that in the passive voice. Protesters struck a journalist with his own microphone. That's in the active voice. Protesters are the ones doing things. They do something violent here. The newspaper is not afraid to say who it was that's doing something violent. A reporter was hit by a pepper ball on live television by an officer who appeared to be aiming at her. It's another thing. We learn to excuse violence in certain populations because of rhetorical choices like this. Implicit bias builds up over time. It's something that you're not always going to see. It has to do with exposure frequency, with how often do you see something worth being scared of. We have implicit bias about a ton of things. This was one of these sort of bizarre studies that is sort of horrible, that I laugh a little bit at it. So for this particular study, what they did, this is gender biases of adult ratings of pediatric pain. They took a bunch of babies and they videotaped them, and they videotaped them getting shot. And then they jabbed them with needles. And then they made people watch the videotapes of them getting shots. And the audience was asked to rate the pain. How much pain is this baby in? And you couldn't tell if they're girl babies or boy babies. They're sitting there in their diapers. There's no way to tell the difference. And so they told the audience, they're like, oh, look, here's a little girl. Watch her get a shot. And they would rate the baby's pain. And here's a little boy, watch him get shot, and they would rate the baby's pain. And then they would switch up the gender and lie about which one was which in other places. And they found that if the audience was told that the baby was a boy, they felt very, very, very sorry for that little boy's pain. And if it was a little girl, they suddenly were like, no, she should just suck it up. She's not in that much pain. She's fine completely. And it didn't actually have anything to do with the gender of the baby. Because we have an implicit bias against women's pain in our culture. You're not allowed to feel pain if you're a woman. We don't take it seriously. And this happens since infancy. This is also seen in student ratings of teaching. If this was a rating of an online class and they had the names of the instructor was the only gender indicator of the teachers, and they switched it for different groups, and if they thought that the class was taught by a man, even though they'd never met him, it was an online class, the professor got higher student ratings. And this is a significant thing that happens across all teacher ratings. There's, I think, on average, a 1 point difference between male ratings and female ratings when it comes to teaching. Weight is a huge source of implicit bias for people. People who are overweight don't get the kind of health care that they should get. Sometimes explicitly, doctors have a bias against this. Sometimes it's implicit. It's both of those things, but you are less likely to be diagnosed with an illness if you're overweight, even if the weight is one of the symptoms of that illness. This happened to a dear friend of mine who suddenly had a plummeting oxygen levels. Her blood oxygen was 40% for no good reason. She was admitted to the hospital and they said, oh, it's because you're fat. And they gave her a tank of oxygen and sent her home and said, try to be less fat. And it was horrifying. Her oxygen didn't get better. It wasn't because she was fat. It was because she had an autoimmune issue and she needed to go on steroids. And she went on steroids and miraculously her blood oxygen went back up. She was not diagnosed the first time around. And that was an incredibly deadly situation. And this happened to me too, personally, where I had skin grafts, and one of the skin grafts was in a place on my hip that if it healed wrong, it could cause me to not walk again. And so the doctor was like, well, if you gained a lot of weight right now and then lost it after the skin graft healed, you could probably avoid not being able to walk. And I was like, that's fine, I'll gain some weight. So I gained some weight. And then I moved to Maryland after I had done this and had to try to get a new oncologist. And the oncologist didn't want to treat my cancer until I lost weight from this one thing, even though the doctor was the one who had told me to do it. So this is a problem. And it's even more frustrating because the history of the research, the BMI, is incredibly racist. And it has nothing to do with health at all. There's many studies where it has nothing to do with health. The man was named, I don't even know how to say that. It's some French guy, I think French. That looked like a French name. He believed that the mathematical... Probably. Yeah, there you go. So he thought the mathematical mean of the population was the ideal. And he proved this by taking the BMI of this big population, and the healthiest people were the ones in the middle. They also happened to be the white ones. And he was like, obviously, that's why BMI is better if you are right in the mean and the ideal that way. They use this for eugenics reasons, not even understanding the fact that any population, you can't do a normal distribution like the BMI. It's a statistical thing within separate populations. A black population is going to have a separate distribution than a white one, but because they have heavier BMIs on average, they're going to not get medical care that they need. They're going to not have that happen.
I've also heard it goes the opposite too with, like, for example, Asian people will have a lower BMI on average, and there are certain diagnoses that you have to hit a certain BMI before they'll check for it. And so you'll have Asian American people who they'll miss like heart disease and stuff because they don't have a high enough BMI according to it.
That happened, interesting, something like that happened to me too with polycystic ovarian syndrome, where they wouldn't diagnose me with it because I didn't have a high enough BMI. But then I went over to the UK and they did an ultrasound. They're like, there's like 17 follicles here. You definitely have this thing going on. But yeah, like BMI is very disconnected from weight and has been used in ways, especially in the beginning of its history, it was used in ways that were very much eugenics type situations. And so this is a bias now we all have. We all have a bias against weight. It can actively harm health. Women of color are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth and Black babies are 2 times more likely to die during birth. Our bias becomes reflected in our language. We can see this. This is a change that's happened over my lifetime. When I was in elementary school, and I'm not that old. I think this is partly because I was raised in the South. I was in this very like Bible Belt area, but I was taught something called the masculine generic grammar. And I was taught that the way to finish this sentence was a student should do his homework. If you don't know the gender of the subject of the sentence, then you always use the masculine generic. And we saw the way that this bias played out in medical history last time when we talked about Doris. This is our Doris. And the mice that had the stem cells that worked versus the ones that didn't, and the way that we've only ever had male lab mice because we have this idea that the masculine experience is the generic experience when it's not. That's a bias that's reflected both in our language and our science sometimes. So over time, people are like, no, you need to not do that. And so for a while, they're like, it should be his or her. And this was when I was an undergraduate. They were teaching it should be his or her, and that's what you should do. And that's sort of frustrating and unwieldy and hard to say. And now it's there, and I am happy about that because not only is it a whole lot easier to say, it recognizes non-binary identities the same way. It doesn't say there's only 2 groups, which is great. Have you ever heard this song? You can't hear it, and you don't have to hear it because Blue Jeans doesn't let me share audio with you, but it's really awkward, this song on Barney that's like everybody's special in his or her own way. This was the song that like my kids had to listen to growing up. It's terrible. I'll let you listen to it later. So when there's different situations where bias exists against certain groups, you have a thing that happens where privilege is. Heather, I'm trying to decide if I should make her come in or if I should use my Heather puppet. She's just like walking around with like donuts over here. I feel, anyway, I'm gonna use my puppet. You're cuter than a puppet? She says she's cuter than a puppet. So you have privilege. So privilege is people, you've heard of privilege, right? And have you heard people complain about privilege and get mad about it? And they're like, I have suffered.
Yeah,
You can't
I
say that I
have.
have not had a terrible life.
Yeah, or like they say, oh, I grew up poor.
Hmm.
You know, I'm a white person, but I grew up poor, so I don't think that I have any privilege.
Right. You will hear this sometimes. And it can be difficult to sort of explain what it means to be privileged. Being privileged does not mean that you have an advantage over anybody. It means that you have the absence of the specific disadvantage. So when Heather first moved in with me, she was in the kitchen. Should I make you come stand up over here? Nah. Okay, I'll let you know. So she was in the kitchen and she looked around the kitchen and she went, Kerry, where's your step stool? And I said, what? What are you talking about? I'm 6 feet tall. Heather's 5'5". This is my Heather puppet. There's Heather. Hi. So she's like down here. And I'm like way up here, right? And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, your step stool. And I just looked at her. I'm like, why do I need a step stool? And she was like, so you can reach things. And I was like, what? And she goes, how do you reach things in the kitchen without a step stool? And I walked over and I just reached it. And I was like, that's how I reach things. And she was like, oh my gosh. Now, does this mean I have privilege here? I never had to think about it. I never had to think about the fact that I didn't have a step stool. I had the absence of a disadvantage. Privilege is blind. You don't know that you have privilege when you have privilege because you haven't had that disadvantage. It's not something that's happened to you, and so you can't imagine it. It's like if you're like running a race and you're getting to work and you think, oh, thank goodness that I got to work on time because there wasn't somebody on the side of the road throwing teddy bears at cars that were passing by. Like, you would never think of that being a problem unless it actually happens. You don't have that being a problem unless it actually happens. And so it's in the absence of that disadvantage that way. And you don't know that you have it. Does this mean that I'm not going to get cancer? The fact that I don't need a step stool in the kitchen. Is it a moral failing? Am I a bad person because I don't have a step stool in my kitchen? No, and privilege is specific and it's contextual. It's in this particular situation, in this specific advantage, I lack a disadvantage. Now, Heather also thinks I have terrible taste in shoes. She thinks that I have like the worst grandma shoes ever. She's not wrong about this, let's be honest. Like, I have a terrible taste in shoes. I love grandma shoes. Like, I don't care. I don't need a cute shoe. I just need like my grandma comfortable shoes. So she decided once we're going to fix this, we're going to change your terrible shoe taste and I'm going to take you shoe shopping. So she took me shoe shopping one day and I'm like, fine, I'll let you take me shoe shopping. So she found like a really cute pair of shoes and she's like, this one is cute. And I'm like, all right, it's cute. And let's try it on. And they didn't have my size because I'm 6 feet tall. I have giant feet. And she was like, well, that's frustrating. So then she found another shoe and they didn't have the size. We went through like 6 shoes before they had one that was in my size. And she went, I think I understand why you hate shoe shopping. It never occurred to her before because she has normal human size feet instead of like big, gigantic feet like me. And so I was like, yeah, that's why I have terrible taste in shoes because I hate shoe shopping. So also I just have terrible taste in shoes. Let's be real. So privilege is not a moral failing. In this situation, Heather had the privilege because she's got like normal human size foot privilege, and it never occurred to her to question that somebody would be able to find a shoe in the store because she's never had a problem finding the shoe in the store. In the other situation, I was the one with privilege because it can change. It's very specific. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have other problems. So how do we account for these blind spots? If privilege is blind and we don't know that we have it, how do we say, okay, how's Doris going to find out that it's a problem that she's only using male lab mice?
Well, we have to do our research. You go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, we educate ourselves.
How do we do that?
We ask and do our research.
Listen to others' experiences.
Yeah, say that louder.
Me? Listen to others' experiences?
Yeah.
We specifically listen to others' experiences and don't privilege or advantage our own over those experiences.
Yeah, we don't invalidate their experiences based on our own by saying, oh, well, that's not how I saw it. Well, that's the point. That is not how I saw it. We're listening to how they experience it.
So do you think that it's possible to think your way out of bias on your own?
No.
Sometimes.
Just not.
You don't know that you have an orthodox opinion until you encounter the heterodox opinion. So you have the different opinion. You have to listen to other people. That is what you have to do. You can't, I don't know of another way to do that. In writing, this is why a really important part of the revision process is the getting outside feedback, because I can make my draft lovely and wonderful and I think that it's perfect. I might be missing some massive thing. This happened to me in my dissertation where I thought that I had asked all of the questions and I literally had like hundreds of them and I had tested them all, and somebody mentioned that I hadn't tested something and it had never occurred to me to test it because it wasn't something that I had ever experienced or seen. And so I was like, well, that's weird, but I'll throw it in there just in case. It ended up being one of the biggest findings of the whole dissertation because it wasn't my experience, but it was there. You have to have, as part of your writing process, feedback. You have to have people that are talking to you, people that are giving you the heterodox opinion. You have to have different viewpoints. You have to have as many different viewpoints as possible when you're looking at your writing, or else it's not going to work. And when we go back to those two rhetorical situations, everybody's going to have blind spots. This is not a moral failing. You are not responsible for the fact that you're going to have a physiological response to certain things. Your brain is going to do what it's going to do. You will have implicit bias. You will have these things, and you won't see them. You won't even be aware of the fact. I watched an interview with Doris once, Miss R. Doris, and they asked her, like, why did you never question the fact that it was weird that all of the lab mice were men? And she's just like, well, why would I question it? I was taught that. It seemed rational. I didn't have a reason to question it. You need a reason to question things. And the only way that you can have a reason to question things is if you are talking to people who have different levels of privilege than you. If you're talking to other groups, if you're getting different viewpoints. I don't think that there is another way. I haven't found one yet. It's not possible to think our way out of that. Does anybody have any questions or anything? All right. That's mostly the end of that one. We didn't really get to use our Heather puppet too much. We stopped the recording.